Hi, listen, good afternoon, everyone. I'm simply the warm-up gig for this fantastic Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust event. I'm Richard, the MP for Gloucester. And the reason why I've invited Alok Sharma to come to Gloucester today and be with you is really three main reasons. The first one is that Alok is a really, well, I think he's a great guy, but he's a very interesting guy for all of you, having been president of COP26, and before that being Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So he can look at what we're doing nationally and internationally in the big picture, and has done so, I think, with great aplomb at that very successful climate change summit. The second reason for inviting him here is that I think we've got a number of special things in Gloucester and Gloucestershire that are worth highlighting, and that includes what's happening in the recycling centre, where there's going to be 90 acres, hectares even, I think, of solar panels that are being planted fairly soon. And there is all sorts of potential for doing both onshore wind and then future hydrogen using water from the River Severn, plus planting lots and lots and lots of trees, some of which the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust is leading on through the Severn Treescape project, some of which Enervert, the owner of the site, is working on with the City Council, and this is all about giving every pupil in the city a chance to plant a tree. So that's an exciting project in its own right. And then the third thing that's special is, of course, this trust, because what you've done and how the trust has changed and expanded the work that you've all done, the role of volunteers, the incredible work with the Friends of groups around the city, which Nikki and others have made a big difference on, I think helps make this city one of the most exciting, greener cities in the country. And I wanted Alok to see that, and for all of you to be able to engage with him. So, on that happy note, I'm going to hand this enormous microphone back to Sophie and hand over to Andrew, the boss of GWT. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you very much, Richard, for that excellent introduction to us at Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and to what we're up to today. So, as Richard said, I'm Andrew McLaughlin. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, and it's a real privilege to be able to welcome Alok to join us today at our headquarters, Robinswood Hill in Gloucester, alongside Richard, our local MP. So today what we're going to do is we're going to be asking Alok for his thoughts on how charities, governments and private sector can really work together to tackle some of those really key, important challenges that are emerging, that are posed to us today by the climate crisis that we're now in. By way of introduction, just to expand on some of Richard's work, Alok's career before becoming an MP was as a qualified chartered accountant and as a senior corporate and private equity advisor in the finance sector. His political career spans more than a decade, having become MP for Reading West in 2010. He's held positions as Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Secretary of State for International Development, and Minister for Housing, amongst others in government. I guess, though, it's really as his role as President of COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which was held in Glasgow back in 2021 now. That means that's the reason we know Alok best in terms of those roles and that link into us here about what we do in Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust today. So in that role, Alok has played a really key role in negotiating the Glasgow Climate Pact, which the key aim of which was to really make 2020 the decade for climate action. And that's part of the area we really want to talk about today through our panel of speakers who'll be asking some questions from Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust and then later from members as well. So Alok's been described as a green growth climate warrior. And Alok cites the powerful influence of system change and motivation to do what is right for future generations. So these are some really important things that we are really keen to tap into within the conservation sector. And it's absolutely fantastic to have someone who's worked at the coalface, as it were, of negotiating that pact and understand the scale of the task that lies ahead of us. So we're looking forward to hearing his thoughts on a range of subjects today, including green finance, the impact on infrastructure and development on the natural environment, and community empowerment as well. And these are the kinds of topics that we'll be picking up straight away through some of our colleagues. So these are some of the big areas of concerns for us as a conservation movement, and it's something that we face on a day-to-day basis. So just to do some brief introductions from colleagues from Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. I'm going to introduce Anna Tarbit, Juliet Hines and Megan Adamu, who collectively hold some really interesting roles for us. So Anna's our Ecosystem Recovery Manager, Juliet is our Head of Evidence, and Megan is our Community Action Officer. So before we dive into the questions, I'm going to hand over to Alok to share some thoughts on the national and international work being undertaken through COP26 and some reflections on the challenges that lie ahead. So welcome, Alok.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And I think I'll do this sort of sitting down, so I think that the camera probably works easy for the cameras. But look, it's great to be here, and thank you so much for what has so far been a really inspiring visit. And I want to pay tribute to your Member of Parliament, and not only because I think he is a fabulous friend to me, but also because in Parliament, he champions this agenda, I mean, literally day in and day out. And one of the recent wins that we've had working together is to persuade the government to move more quickly on lifting the effective ban on onshore wind. And that's something we work very collegiately on with government ministers and colleagues, and it shows, right? If you explain things and you have good discussions with people, you can bring about change in a very sort of collegiate way. And I've also been incredibly impressed with the visits that I've been on today, particularly to the Eco Park. And I think meeting the school children, the school pupils, I don't know what the phrase is these days, but meeting them and seeing really quite how inspired they were with the work that they were doing and all the tree planting, I think that was great. And thank you also for everything that you as an organisation do, both nationally but also locally as well. I went for a lovely walk before lunch, and it really is so good for the soul to actually be out in the countryside. And I spoke at an event joint event organised earlier this week by the British Museum, the Natural History Museum and Kew. And on the panel, very similar to this, there was one person who was talking about the scientifically proven health benefits of actually being out in nature and connecting with nature. So thank you for everything that you do. What I want to talk about a little bit is take you back to almost 2 years ago to COP26, move forward to what has happened since then, and then of course in a few weeks from now the world is gathering for COP28 in Dubai. And what certainly my hopes and expectations are. I am no longer in the government. I am not negotiating on behalf of the UK, but I can certainly comment, as we all can, on these matters. So if you think back to almost 2 years ago, we were in a situation where COVID was still amongst us, and that shadow was extending over everything, quite frankly. We also then had the terrible impact on all of our economies. Quite rightly, countries, including ours, of course, we stepped forward with funding to support people's lives and livelihoods during that very difficult time, and businesses as well. But it stretched all the economies around the world, and we were having to deal with all of that. And the geopolitics was actually getting worse even at that point. And then we know that with Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, things got a lot worse in 2022. But despite all of that, under the UK's presidency, we managed to get almost 200 countries to agree to the Glasgow Climate Pact. And again, I just want to make this very clear, is that that was a huge UK team effort. Ministers across departments, envoys like Richard, talking to counterparts in other governments, our brilliant diplomatic service, the fabulous civil servants that I had to work with. It was a huge, huge team effort, and that is what got this thing over the line. And people have said to me subsequently from other governments that COP26 and what the UK achieved was probably one of the biggest soft power wins that we have had in a sort of very positive sense in decades. So what did we get over the line? Well, we managed to persuade countries to come forward with more ambitious plans to cut emissions. We managed to get more finance on the table from developed countries to support developing nations, particularly adapting to climate change. We managed to get from 30% of the global economy covered by a net zero target to over 90%. Just about every single G20 nation signed up during the arc of our presidency to net zero. And we also managed to get big commitments from the business community. Thousands of businesses across the world, including in the UK, signing up to net zero. We had $130 trillion of financial assets committed to go to net zero. And you will all remember, if you were watching at the time or read about it afterwards, we had a wobble in the final hours. And I think it was interesting, Andrew, you talked about the coal face. That was the one thing we were trying to avoid, too much more coal. And we had a disagreement where China and India raised concerns about the language on phasing out of coal. We did, in the end, settle on language on phasing down of coal use. And this was the first time in any COP in 26 years that we had managed to get language on coal. And even up until that morning, I still had those texts on me. I was getting texts from really quite serious people saying, well done, the UK's had a really good go at this. You're probably not going to get the coal text in any form or shape. But we did. And again, it was a big UK effort. So why did countries sign up to this really quite ambitious agenda, despite all of the differences that they had? And I think there were a number of reasons. One is that countries have recognized that it was in their collective self-interest. They saw the impact on lives, on livelihoods, and infrastructure in their own countries. During the time that I was involved with COP26, I went to over 50 countries, many of them twice, some of them 3 times, some of them 4 times, to try and persuade governments and businesses in those countries to be much more ambitious. And, I met people on the front line of climate change as well. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. I remember being on the island of Barbuda, which a few years earlier had been hit by a hurricane called Hurricane Irma. And as you stood in the center of that island and you looked around, to me, it literally felt like a hurricane had blown in a few weeks earlier. Yes, there'd been some repairs, but a lot of it was not repaired. And then you speak to the people who are still on that island, and what they say is that they're frightened. They're frightened because what they can see are these climatic events becoming more ferocious and more frequent. And so their message at that point to me was, please tell the biggest emitters, tell those G20 nations responsible for 80% of global emissions, they have to cut these emissions. These are islands, these are small countries which they don't even figure in terms of the emissions, but they're on the front line of having to battle with climate change. I was at the UN General Assembly in 2022 and I met the Pakistani climate change minister. And this was at a point where a third of her country was underwater because of a climatic event. And just to put that into context, a third of Pakistan in area is more than the whole of the United Kingdom put together. I mean, can you just imagine what it would be like if we were faced with similar circumstances? And it was a really very difficult conversation to have. So I could go on, but I think the point is that countries understood it was in their self-interest, and they understood that climate change ultimately does not recognize borders. I think the second reason that countries signed up is because they've understood the science. They've accepted the science, and the science is very clear. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is very clear that it is human activity which is responsible for global warming. Cost. There is a huge cost to not dealing with this issue now. Many of you will be aware, and I'm sure you've heard from Lord Nick Stern, who sits obviously in the House of Lords, but is an eminent economist. And he brought out a report some years ago, the Stern Review, where he estimated that the cost of unmitigated climate change could be up to 20% of global GDP every year. I mean, just think about that. Here in the UK, we have an independent Office for Budget Responsibility. They brought out a risk report a little while ago, and they estimated that unless we deal with this issue, the unmitigated cost of climate change will lead to our national debt being almost 300 times, almost being 300% of the size of our economy by the end of the century. Now, Richard, we I think regard ourselves as fiscally responsible politicians. And there is no way we should be looking to leave that kind of legacy for our children and their children. And governments also recognise that there are increased risks exacerbating existing problems that we have in the world. Food security, water security, migration. Last year, the estimates are there were more people in the world who had to effectively were displaced because of climate change, 32 million, than because of wars and conflict, 28 million. And there is a physical security issue here as well, because very sadly there are terrorist groups like ISIS, like Al-Shabaab, which use scarcer resources and the impact of climate change as a recruiting sergeant for their own evil ends. And so the reason countries signed up, because overall they understood that the cost on every level of not tackling this issue now, way higher than the cost of tackling it. So that's what we signed up to. And the International Energy Agency estimated that if you add up all the commitments that were made at COP26, including the net zero commitments, the world is heading towards 1.8 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. Now, that I have to say is still going to be a disaster for very many people in the world. But nevertheless, if you look at the arc of how this temperature curve has gone, before Paris Agreement came into place, the scientists were estimating we were heading towards 4 degrees. Post-Paris, 3 degrees. Post-Glasgow, below 2 degrees. But only if all of those commitments are actually delivered upon. And that's why I said at Glasgow that COP26 was a fragile win and that 1.5 was on life support. So fast forward 2 years, where are we now? Well, we're at global temperatures of 1.2 degrees on average above pre-industrial levels. Now, we've seen the impact on our own country with heat waves last year. This year, the scientists tell us, is the hottest year on record ever. And those warning signs just keep coming. Earlier this year, the World Meteorological Organization, together with the Met Office, put together a report where they said that we are likely to breach, on the balance of probabilities, the 1.5 degree at some point over the next 5 years. Now, that may be a temporary breach, but still not going to be good news. And that's why, I keep making the point when I continue to talk to governments is that we just need to go a lot faster with the delivery of action. And so, are we, can we keep 1.5 alive? I think we can, but that window is closing unless we act a lot faster. Now, just to give you some sort of positivity here as well, because of the big fall in renewable costs of wind and solar over the last decade, you're starting to see a lot more deployment. Last year, 3/4 of all the new capacity that was deployed for electricity was wind and solar. There are estimates that over the next few years, the amount of electricity generated globally, more of that will come from renewables than anything else. 5 years ago, 1 in 70 new cars sold in the world were electric vehicles. This year, the estimate is it'll be 1 in 5. So we are moving forward, but we need to go a lot faster. So let me end with COP28 and what I hope we will see emerge from it. I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that the geopolitics has got a lot worse than where we were 2 years ago. Shadow of the war in Ukraine still continues to hang over the world. We've got the conflict now in the Middle East. But for me, leaders were able to put aside differences, however difficult they may have been 2 years ago. And I hope, in that spirit of self-interest, they will do so again this year when it comes to the specific discussion on climate. And so, a number of things that I would love to see coming out of this COP. Firstly, we've had a stock take where the world has had a look and said, this is what we promised to do, this is what we've achieved, how much further do we need to go? And we need to go a lot further, a lot faster. So what I would like to see is detailed plans, sector by sector, how are countries going to cut their emissions in transport, in energy, in agriculture. The second thing we need to do is to see a big increase in the renewables rollout across the world, tripling the amount of capacity across the world that we have now. And there are parts of the world like Africa where we need to get 6 times the level of capacity by 2030 and then obviously beyond that as well. We also need to address the issue of fossil fuels. And we tried last year at COP27 80 countries, including the UK, trying to get language on the phasing out of unabated fossil fuels. I hope we will get that this year because, by the way, I'm not here saying that we should sort of turn off the taps overnight. This is going to be a transition. Even in a net zero scenario, we will need some fossil fuels, but we have to acknowledge that 75% of all emissions are energy related, and that's why we have to address this issue. We have to address the issue of countries agreeing to when emissions will actually peak and try and stick with that. And the final piece of this is on finance, because none of this is going to be possible unless we get a significant amount of finance deployed to supporting nations, particularly developing nations. And there are various estimates out there. One estimate suggests that it will cost us $125 trillion to get to a point where we get to a global net zero economy. And that money, a lot of it has got to come from the private sector, and we have to find solutions for that. So those are some of my hopes and expectations for COP28. And I hope that what will happen on this occasion is that what world leaders say, the rhetoric of their speeches, will actually match their action and their delivery. And frankly, our future, the future of our kids and their kids, absolutely depends on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alok.
Thank you.
That's been amazing to hear your insight and particularly your hopes for the future as well. And I suppose one of the things we're keen to pick up on is some of those themes, and particularly how they apply at the very local level, recognising there's an international perspective, there's a national perspective, and the work that we're part of locally in terms of how we address that, thinking particularly through the lens of nature and the biodiversity crisis that sits alongside the climate crisis and indeed is impacted by it at the same time. So I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to pick up on that theme of finance and funding and how that work happens.
Hi, Ella. It is potentially one of the longest questions ever written, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. I think it follows on some of the themes you've already mentioned, but as we know, research shows half the world's GDP mandates are dependent on nature, and we know that nature can help us adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. There seems to be a growing appetite internationally and nationally for business to invest in and fund projects that provide nature-based and natural capital solutions. However, much of that capital is unavailable to charities such as Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust because we can't currently work at the scale the finance and banking industry is required. So as an example, the UK Infrastructure Bank, their minimum investment is 25 million, which is quite a lot. The market as it stands also lacks the required standards and accreditation for nature markets to be seen as truly investable. So how do you think we can improve and increase our capacity and capability to engage in these new methods of financing, given there are no guarantees around nature markets or that funding will end up being forthcoming? So how do you think government can help support this, both in terms of policy and through direct funding?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would just say is that in terms of the Wildlife Trust, I think the great advantage you've got is that you are effectively a national body. It is the case that if there are large organisations in the private sector, for instance, looking to partner, a lot of the time they will want to find a larger organisation that they can partner with, who then help to cascade funds down. And in fact, over lunch, we were having a discussion about the partnership that you have with Aviva, and I think there's about £38 million in play there, which is great, and that allows a cascading of finance. But I get this point about what are the standards? How do you get this sort of funding in place nationally? And the government does have a plan to get, I think, about £500 million of private sector money into nature by 2027, and then sort of increase that to $1 billion over a number of years. And they are working with BSI on standards. So that work is ongoing. But it's like everything else is. I mean, Richard and I know this from sort of government, is that you just want to see everything speeded up. And it isn't that things aren't happening either in this country or indeed across the world. There's lots of very positive things happening. It's just the pace at which it all needs to happen to allow us to then keep and hopefully be able to reach our commitments on net zero by the middle of the century.
Okay. But I mean, I guess how do you, for us, I think, obviously going straight from, it's a real different change of funding mechanism for us. So we've been really successful in getting grant funding in, and we're delivering some really big, ambitious landscape scale projects. But we need to start talking in a different language about investment and talking to buyers and understanding that. And I think to scale up to the sort of the size of investment that some of these big players, and you're talking about your pension markets and those sorts of things, where real trillions and trillions of pounds worth of money is potentially available, is a massive jump. And I just think, how can that be supported? Because the learning that needs to come from that, we really need, I guess, on the ground, is this sort of high risk, early stage pathfinder investment. And I think that's what we're missing. There seems to be loads of investment here. There's some investment there. And how do we bridge that gap? Because we need to, and we need to do it quickly. And I think it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on that.
So I think what you raise is actually a really big sort of macro issue here as well, which is we need to get more private finance flowing into nature. We need to get more private finance flowing into adaptation, and of course into mitigation projects as well. And one of the things at a sort of big macro level that a lot of people have said, and I've recently joined the Rockefeller Foundation, which is a philanthropy, and one of the things that we're working on is how do we support to bring about that change where public money catalyzes many multiples of private finance as well. And this has become a big agenda for the World Bank. There's a new president, Ajay Banga, has come in, and he's put climate as one of the key issues front and center for the first time, actually in a very sort of formal way. And he's also set up a group of CEOs from the biggest financial companies to work on sort of solutions as to how do you ensure that the private sector is able to invest. And look, we talked about pension funds. The pension funds ultimately belong to those of us who have got pensions in them. So they have a fiduciary duty to ensure that they invest, that they can see that they're going to get a return. And I think some of the sort of products that people have talked about, I've certainly talked about, is having first loss guarantees from multilateral development banks and others to allow the private sector to invest. But I think there is one thing that if we could ensure every financial institution, every multilateral organization, every private sector organization does, which is effectively to embed climate risk in every single financial decision that they take. And if we were able to get that kind of framework in place, I can tell you money would definitely flow to the right projects to address this issue of climate change and nature depletion.
Thank you very much, Alok. Moving on to Juliet now.
So this is a question about the fact that we essentially have a finite area of land in this country, really. So right now, one of the key issues for conservation organisations, politicians and the wider public is housing. We know that more housing needs to be built to meet demand, but the current system often delivers bigger houses because they're more profitable and not the sort of housing that we actually need to meet demand. And this places an incredible strain on nature, but also the failure of the local plan system often allows developers to work around the need for biodiversity and environmental mitigation. So the question is, how do we make the local planning system work more effectively and address that balance of power between the local authorities, developers and nature?
So may I ask a question? How many of you have engaged with the local plan process in your area? And you are kind of, this is kind of the pinnacle of knowledge and sort of willingness to engage. So how many of you have done that? Okay, so a number. In a way, that's the first thing we need to do, is basically to explain to people that we are in a sort of democratic process and you can absolutely engage on these issues. If I think in my own constituency, we have parish councils which do local plans. They then consult very widely actually with the local community. That then obviously moves up to sort of the county level. And I think that's the first thing, is engagement in the plan, because quite a lot of the time what happens is that something will emerge and afterwards people say, well, hang on a minute, that wasn't something that I agreed to. And if we could only find a way of ensuring that actually that information is made available to people and that engagement process actually works, I think that would be the first thing to do. The second thing is that, I mean, as you said, Andrew, I was at one point, for a period of time, the Housing and Planning Minister. And I think the one thing that sort of struck me is that actually in this country, you know, we need to make more appealing and beautiful homes, right? I think, you know, that I think is very important. But what we also need to make sure is that to go with those homes, that people actually can go out nearby in nature. And there are various sort of regulations and recommendations in place in terms of the distance between a development and you know, access to parks and all the rest of it. And there is a sort of tension here, and I think we have to acknowledge that. I mean, if I again go back and think in my own constituency, we have a beautiful area of land. I mean, it's a little bit like this, where we have a hill called Pinson's Hill, and for many years, with local campaigners, we worked really hard to ensure that there's no building on that. And that's not because people don't want housing. There's lots of other housing going in, but they still want to have a place which is nature, where you have wildlife, where you can go for a walk, and you know, you can sort of relax. So it's a very sort of long-winded answer, but I think engaging with the plan is very important. And then I do think, I mean, you talked about the amount of the country that's been built on. I mean, I think it's around 7% of all our land. I mean, I'm sure somebody will correct me. Will somebody correct me? No? Okay. But I think and nationally, I think 7% of the land is sort of built on. And so we have to find more imaginative ways about, you know, where else we can build. But for me, this sort of local consent is really, really important. And that's why getting people involved in that process early, I think is pretty vital, actually.
So I would say actually getting involved with the process is quite hard for people at the moment, just because they don't necessarily understand the process. But I think one of the other problems is where people, you know, might have engaged in a local plan, when that plan then gets stuck in the system and doesn't actually get approved and through, it does leave those districts open then to sort of the power of developers, where the local council might reject an application, but then the developers have the financing to take that through to judicial review, where essentially they get told the housing targets are not being met, so it gets put through anyway. So, you know, how do you think we can solve that problem? How can we make sure that these local plans are actually completed and delivered to prevent that sort of situation happening?
So look, I mean, I think it's very challenging. I think we all accept that we need more homes, right? I mean, I've got two daughters, 24 and 22. At some point, hopefully, they're in a position where they might be able to afford to buy a home. Around where you know, I live in Reading, actually, house prices relative to average salaries, that multiple is quite large. So I think we have to accept that we're going to need more house buildings that's got to take place. But again, I mean, I don't know if Richard wants to comment from a sort of local perspective here, but from my perspective, I can tell you that there have been on sort of individual sites where there is a sort of a real a groundswell of sort of support to ensure that either something is built on or is not built on. We have managed, certainly in my constituency, working with local people to ensure that the plan reflects much more what local people want to see. So I agree with you, sometimes it is very challenging and everybody leads busy lives. And so, you know, getting involved and sort of, you know, with a plan. But I think this is where actually organisations like yours are so valuable in working with local MPs, local councillors, to get those views from the local community to them as well. I know, Richard, is there anything you wanted to add from a, because I don't want to comment on what's going on locally, because I don't know.
I think the only comment locally that I think everyone here could probably relate to is that we are very keen on
the live stream.
Yeah, we're very keen locally, Alok, on promoting brownfield site development. So that's around the city centre, which is not, of course, in the city centre physically here. It's right out on the sort of north edge by the river. But so we're doing a lot of work on that. But it's also true that where there are developments, and there's one that's been proposed about 1.5 miles from here in an otherwise green valley, which would put enormous strains on the infrastructure, the traffic, the schools, air pollution, you name it, we will all stand up very strongly against that. And we can only do that credibly if we are building enough houses that we need for our children and grandchildren on all these other brownfield sites. And that will involve taking some hard decisions about the heights of buildings. We may need to find that we need more buildings around the city centre in particular that are not just 3 stories high, but 5 and possibly 7. And that may be the sort of compromise and payoff that we need to look at.
Great.
So I'll pass over to Megan now.
So for many people, the narrative around the climate and biodiversity crises is overwhelming and even frightening. People want to take action but don't know where to start. It's also true that for lots of people there's a real desire to make change and engage with decision makers, but again they don't know where to begin. So in your view, what's the best way for members of the public to engage with politicians about the climate and biodiversity crisis locally and nationally to get real meaningful change?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing that you can do is actually go and badger your member of parliament. And I'm not suggesting where's exactly, yeah, exactly. But it's amazing actually when you have meetings like this and you ask the question, how many of you in the last 6 months have gone to see your member of parliament on a particular issue? And actually, lots of people haven't. And of course, it's important to write to your member of parliament or your local councillors, but actually going and physically seeing them. And MPs are, whatever people may think, are pretty accessible. You can go and see your MP. I have, I've been an MP since 2010. I have a set of constituents who've been coming to me on a very regular basis over that time, and having conversations on issues around climate, issues around nature, and actually it's really very helpful. I think you'll find as a member of parliament you quite like the idea of people coming in, and it perhaps gives you a perspective that you didn't previously have. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you feel you're able to, stand for elective office yourself. I mean, if you want to bring about change, that's certainly one way of doing it. And I think the third thing is, I was at an event speaking at Oxford University last night, and we had this discussion about climate assemblies, and what is the kind of sort of mechanism, whether you need to see more of that. I think those the last time we had a climate assembly, I remember then I was the business secretary then, but of course also doing COP. And I remember having actually really very fruitful discussions with some of the conclusions and the individuals who'd put those final reports together. That's certainly a mechanism I know some people feel would benefit from further amplification. But I think this issue of how do you yourself in your daily life bring about change for the better is absolutely vital. It's really important. And I find that actually not just talking to people in the UK, but when you go around the world and you meet civil society groups, is that same thing where people want to do the right thing, but how do they sort of find out about it? And if you look at the latest report from the Climate Change Committee, one of the things that they recommend is basically some form of informational campaign. So not saying to people, you must do this or you mustn't do that, but here are the things that you could do in terms of how you travel, in terms of potentially your diet. I mean, I've given up eating meat. That's not for everyone, and I will never say to someone, don't eat meat or don't do that. But actually, if you say to people, what are the benefits of a varied diet? I mean, those are the sort of informational bits that I think is really important to get out to people, and it's interesting that the Climate Change Committee in this latest report is suggesting that's something that perhaps ought to be considered.
Thank you very much. Now, we have some questions from Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust members ready to go. So, Sophie, over to you.
Thanks. Before we move on to member questions, I just wonder if there's anything else that the panel kind of want to put to Alok. We have had lots of questions in, but just another couple of minutes before we move on.
Trying to have a look there. I mean, I could go on about finance forever, so we won't. But I guess, do you think government should play more of a role? I know that you don't like to tell people what to do, but actually, do you think all of the voluntary codes around carbon, potentially around nature and biodiversity, will, I know you're talking about companies should embed carbon and embed nature within them. Do you think that will happen without any policy driving that through government or without it becoming mandatory? Do you think that's a realistic ambition? Because obviously people, you know, they've got lots of things to consider and you might want to do something, but whether or not you will, you know, does it need a bit of a stick in some of these situations?
So we do have emissions trading schemes. I mean, we've got one in the UK. There are, obviously, the EU's got one. China has introduced an emissions trading scheme. You've got the EU has bringing forward a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is being put into place. See what happens in this country. But again, I mean, taking this to a sort of macro level, ideally what you want is a global price on carbon. And if you had a global price on carbon, and look, it's very challenging. I mean, I've been in these sort of negotiations where trying to get everyone to agree to something is really challenging. But if you're able to get agreement over a period of time on a global price on carbon, that again, it's a bit like embedding climate risk into all financial decisions. Suddenly you start to see the change in flows of money, and that's what then makes a positive difference.
Just a kind of follow up, actually, that I was thinking about. What would be really interesting for me to hear from you as an MP as well, especially, is, so my role, obviously, community action officer, I want to empower people to be able to take meaningful change. And if people want to go to their MPs, in your view, do you think it's better to go to an MP with, I want to do this, 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 or to go with a specific campaign like water or planting trees or something to initiate that engagement? I'm just really curious as to what the best way to initiate that conversation is.
Well, you've got two MPs here, so Richard would also sort of, I'm sure, have views on this. My own view on this is that, I'm perfectly happy to have either a general conversation with a constituent who may come with a sort of world view on something and want that sort of somehow reflected in something that I'm doing or something that is being done in government. Or you are absolutely right, people will come and say, listen, wouldn't it be great if in this park we did lots of tree planting, and by the way, UMP, can you work out how we get an extra sort of 200-300 trees donated, either with support from the local companies or whatever it is? I mean, I think it depends, but you're right. I think going with something very practical, particularly on a local level, is something that as a member of parliament you can certainly go about effecting.
Yeah, I mean, Megan, that is a great question, and Alok is quite right. There are different ways of going about it. Some people write in what I call the lecturing tone. It is absolutely disgraceful that the government isn't doing X, Y, Z. Some people write in the "this is what I want to do" tone. How are you going to help me? And other people ask sort of open questions, which are more like, how can I get involved in doing something useful in my community? Of the three of those, I like the last one best because it's basically an offer of volunteering. And so if I can steer them towards one of the Friends of groups and all the work that this trust is doing to bring them together and share best practice, find avenues of funding and tools and all the rest of it, that is fantastic. Because we all know, as actually both Andrew and Alok were saying earlier, we know the health benefits from getting involved in this apart from anything else. So that is amazing. The other thing is that there are real opportunities where something might have come from one of us. So, for example, I'm going to take Alok later to see a thing called the Sudbrook Community Garden, which is a new green space in Treadworth that I came up with an idea of, but actually the City Council and Rooftop Housing provided the funding for, and then Jenny, who works with me, used to be a councillor. She project managed it. Now, at the moment, we're really looking for a bit of help on planting bulbs and shrubs and things, and I think there's an opportunity to do some work with the Wildlife Trust and for volunteers to then look after it and own it effectively afterwards. So there are all sorts of different opportunities. But one way of doing it is to have a session line up here. You can offer me and Richard, the leader of the council, who is probably the greenest leader we've had for donkey's years, ask us up here and then throw out your best ideas and thoughts and then see how we can help. And we can offer 1 or 2 ideas as well.
Great. So just before we go into members' question, I guess it's just pulling together a few of those different themes. It'd be really good to get your reflections on these. So I suppose one of the positions that we're in as Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust is we quite often pick up those kinds of concerns, sometimes I guess on MPs' behalf, about things that are happening in their local area. So Juliet was talking about this in terms of planning those large developments that go in. We're obviously looking at large infrastructure projects as well. And I guess one of the things that we observe is nature's quite often the fall guy in some of those big complex decisions where there are various different trade-offs that are happening. So quite often cost pressures are coming in, developers are very keen to do things in one way. And I suppose one of the things that we quite often see is nature as the fall guy in that whole situation. How do we make the case that really picks up on that point about things going faster and deeper in terms of the recovery that we need to make? How do we build on that case and make sure those kind of things happen in the kind of way that we observe and a lot of our members observe as well?
Well, again, I mean, Richard will have view on this. I mean, but from my sort of perspective, is to basically keep banging the drum, keep making sure that message gets out. And I think Richard made sort of reference to the tone in which people ask you to do things. And frankly, this is not really about politics. Just to me, generally, how you interact with human beings is that if you are polite, but sort of requesting something that will actually lead to something positive, whether it's a member of parliament or anybody else, they will react much more positively to that. So, but it is this sort of constant drumbeat, and as I keep going back to the set of 2 constituents who have coming in year after year on climate and nature issues with me, and I've learned a lot from them during that time, and hopefully I've sort of managed to make a little bit of a difference on some of the things that they've been interested in. But keep talking about it, keep banging the drum.
Okay, thank you very much. Great, now over to our members.
Yeah, great. We've had lots of questions coming in online from members. So we'll start with one from James Endicott, who has asked, to what extent is the government backtracking on climate commitments and pledges? And is the UK doing enough to set an example and maintain leadership in tackling the climate crisis?
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing I just want to say is that, obviously I'm not in a government minister any longer, so I will sort of set out my own views on this, and Richard will want to comment as well. I think one of the things that we have had in this country for a long period of time is a political consensus around these matters, and I think that's very important. And, we still have a position where all the main political parties are committed to our legally binding commitment to net zero by 2050. They are committed to our legally binding carbon budgets. That's, obviously the government, the Labour Party, Lib Dems, etc., are all committed to this. We, have had recently, obviously, some changes in policy. For instance, on electric vehicles, the point at which you phase out the sale of new petrol and diesel, and that obviously has an impact. And I've been sort of quite vocal on all of this. So I think Richard can see what I've said about all of this previously. But I think the one thing I can tell you from all the interactions that I continue to have with governments around the world is that they recognise that the UK is a leader in this area. And look, over the last 30 years, through successive governments, we've managed to grow our economy by almost 80%, and yet we've cut emissions by around 50%. Right? I mean, that has happened. And in fact, if we talk about this government, since 2010, we've built effectively the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world. So there's lots of positive things happening. But I think this point of leadership on this issue, I think, is very important. And I think COP26 was a sort of big high point. And the world wants us to continue to lead. And I know people will say that, well, we're only 1% of territorial emissions globally. Others need to do more. Of course others need to do more. Of course the G20 countries need to do more collectively. and individually. But I think the one thing that we learned from COP26 is that if you are ambitious domestically, you then have the moral authority to ask others to do more. And that's why we managed to get over 90% of the world committed to net zero. So I hope that that is what we will continue to do, to continue to lead. And the Prime Minister is going to COP28, which I applaud. I'm looking forward to hearing what he says. And I hope we're going to have another positive message from the UK.
Just on that, Alok, do you think, just to give it a specific example, but obviously there's been some great commitments by government, like the net zero you refer to, but the government's own net zero strategy was deemed to be unlawful by the High Court. So because it didn't actually contain evidence and detail of how that would be done. So I think it's those sorts of things. It's great to talk about and it's great to hear ambition, but what we need is detail and we need targets and we need all that stuff. And I think that's some of the things that seems to be lacking at that national or international level. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so actually in terms of the net zero strategy, I think it was on the, as I say, I'm not in the government, so I'm not here sort of speaking as a government minister, just to be very clear, but I think very objectively the issue there was that there wasn't enough of a breakdown of how we were going to reduce emissions on a sort of sector by sector basis and as policies, and I think that's being put right. And by the way, I would just say that when I was a business secretary, and also doing the COP role. I mean, that's when we put together our nationally determined contribution, when we put together our 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. There is an enormous amount of work that is done in coming up with these decisions. And, we have brilliant civil servants. I mean, really, really brilliant people that I work with, that Richard has worked with across departments, who do an enormous amount of detailed work that, perhaps you can't just sort of open everything up and say, look, this is the months of work that's gone into this particular policy. But there is a lot going on. Let's just take, for instance, the fact that to keep on track to a net zero world by the middle of this century, we need to reduce emissions globally by over 40% by 2030. Now, the IPCC has said that actually we've basically got just about all the technologies to at least try and meet the 2030 target. The issue is we are not going fast enough. So for me, you can have policies, but you're right, it's about delivery and the pace of that. And certainly historically, compared to many other nations, we've been pretty good at that. That doesn't mean you rest on your laurels, and you need to show leadership yourself to continue to persuade others. But there is a lot that's been happening, and I think continues to happen in the UK. And sometimes I feel a little bit that we're a little bit sort of British about this, where we beat ourselves up on things where actually, if like I said, I've spoken to very many governments around the world. And they have certainly historically seen the UK as a poster child for green growth.
Take another member's question then. Picking up on some of the kind of themes that Juliet's talked about already, we've had a few questions in about development and planning. So developments are still being built cheaply and with a lack of proper insulation and a lack of renewable energy. How can we force house builders to build more eco-friendly houses?
Yeah, so look, again, simply I think you need to make sure that you have the right sort of eco standards in place for that. And I think insulation is a case in point as well, where, in the 6 months to March this year, as a result of, the hike in energy prices caused, by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the government stepped forward and supported individuals and businesses to the tune of £40 billion. Absolutely the right thing to do. Absolutely the right thing to do, to support people at a time when costs were spiking. But again, I mean, if 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we had invested that kind of money in insulation, that would now be paying dividends because people's bills would have been a lot lower. So I just think it doesn't matter who's in government. You have to have a sort of long-term view on this and actually think that when you're making spending decisions, they're also for the long term. So the government, I think, has brought out some more policy on insulation. And I think generally, going back to this point about people wanting to do the right thing, they absolutely want to do the right thing. I think what you need to make sure is that you provide incentives, effectively carrots, for people to do the right thing. So whether it's replacing your boiler with a heat pump, there's now a £7,500 grant if you want to do it. Or as we had previously to get the electric vehicle market going in this country, you had plug-in grants. Those are sort of incentives we need to see a lot more of. And by the way, that's not, like I said, I try and take a bit of a sort of global view on this. I'm not just talking about the UK, but that is something that ought to be happening internationally as well.
That's good for house buyers, but what about house builders? Because that seems to put the onus on the people that own the house to make that retrofit their house to make it good. Whereas I think, which is fine for people, we've got a really historically old housing stock which needs retrofitting, but new houses aren't being built to the right energy standards, and what should government or how do we make housing developers do that?
Yeah. Well, so retrofitting is something that is going to have to happen. And again, I know we're sitting here in the UK, but that is that's a challenge that countries across the world are facing. And yes, I think you need to bring forward those standards that are required on house builders. Sure.
An interesting question here that I think for yourself and for reflections from the wider panel potentially as well, from Conrad Jones. He's asked, does the government's current policy in a number of areas, such as net zero, water and agriculture, mean increasingly adversarial relationships with wildlife organisations are inevitable?
Well, I don't know whether Richard wants to comment from a sort of local point of view, but I hope that is not. Look, the point with this is that if we're going to get there and to get these targets, we need to make sure that we are all working together on that shared agenda. And actually, this room is a really good example of this, right? You've got your local council leader and councillors. You've got your local MP. I've turned up from Reading. It's only an hour and a quarter on the train. You've got effectively civil society represented as well as local individuals. This is how we ought to be doing business effectively, actually working together. So I don't think any government sets out to be adversarial. We need to find ways that we work more closely together. I know, Richard, if there's sort of any particular thing you want to say or any examples locally on this.
Thanks so much. Sophie, I think the answer to the question is probably, from my perspective, it's inevitable that we draw even closer. And that's happened over the, whatever it is, almost 14 years that I've been MP here, is that the work that I've done and my office has done and the local council has done with the Wildlife Trust has got closer and closer. A really good example is the Green Energy and Eco Park at Hempstead we've just come from. Because originally the Wildlife Trust wasn't involved in that. In a sense, there was no direct need to. The council were going to give the planning permissions for the green energy. The company who owns the site were going to do the applications. They and us agreed on this program of tree planting. But your previous CEO, Roger, thought there was real opportunity to do much more together. And then once you had the Severn Treescape project, which was going to go along the River Severn, right where the recycling centre is, there were huge opportunities for synergy. And then you took on Merrick, who had been with the City Council, so that brought the two organisations closer together immediately. So I think what should happen actually is much closer relationships, and the more we have these sort of get-togethers, Alok's wonderful visit and giving us a day out of his life has enabled this in a sense, but this is something that we can do locally much more often, I hope.
And can I just say that I think it's added more than a day to my life as a result of coming here for half a day. But I just want to make, because I think this is it's a very important point that's been raised about sort of working together. Now, one of the things that the Prime Minister said recently, which is absolutely correct, which is that we need to find a way of getting our grid strengthened and built out faster and better. And the reason for that is that if we're going to deploy 4 times the amount of offshore wind, 5 times the amount of solar, which is all part of the government's plan, by 2030, you're going to need to have a much more strengthened grid in place. And that is a challenge, by the way. That's not just a UK challenge. That is a challenge across countries in Europe, countries in Asia. We're all facing this. But as part of that, we have to be able to collectively explain to people why is it that there will be infrastructure needed, which may affect their view, or they may be sort of concerned about particular sorts of infrastructure going near them. Why that is good for them, and then how do you sort of again incentivize people, support people to basically help that process of this infrastructure being deployed at some pace. One of the things that Richard and I did, as I said, with other colleagues, was to persuade the government to go faster on ending the ban on onshore wind. And one of the things that we were very keen on, which is coming forward, is effectively community benefit to individuals, either through lower bills or through other community benefits in the local area, to take infrastructure. And that can only happen when there is a dialogue between government at a national level, between local government and community groups as well. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for us over the coming years. And I said, it doesn't matter what your political hue is, that is something that we need to do if we're committed to net zero by 2050, and that's something that we have to collectively build.
Can I just say,
Sure.
you mentioned sort of long-term view earlier, and I think it's critically important that we and the government have a long-term view of things rather than sort of swinging back and forth between, you talk about the Treescapes project, trees obviously will take hundreds of years to develop. When we're talking about putting infrastructure in, at the moment there's quite a lot of things like solar farms going in. We need to consider what's the longer term impact. Yes, we want to get to net zero, but are we putting them in the right place? Should they be going on buildings rather than on agricultural land? Because obviously we need areas for food production as well. So I think that longer term view and that assessment of cumulative impact is going to be critical for us to achieve all of these things.
Yeah, no, and you're right, and I think that, as I understand, that is part of the government plan, is in terms of rooftop solar. I mean, you see this in lots of other countries. There's no reason why you shouldn't have it here. I mean, in fact, I met a Swedish diplomat earlier this week who was telling me that they've got solar in Sweden. And who would have think you'd be solar in Sweden? But during particularly the summer months, people have rooftop solar, and they're plugging energy back into the grid. So that is something. But look, it just goes back to this issue of the pace of doing all of this. And one of the things that I think we definitely need to do is speed up our planning processes. And that will mean some difficult decisions and difficult conversations with local communities. But if you are committed, and not just say you're committed, but you're truly committed to decarbonise our economy, that will mean some difficult decisions. And we have to speed things up. And the EU, for instance, as some of their plans have announced, a deadline over a sort of relatively short period of time, a couple of years, to get projects which are sort of green projects through their planning system. I mean, those are the sort of things that we need to think about. And again, this is not, for me, this is a collective thing that we need to agree on. So we're not constantly fighting on these issues.
And I think you're absolutely right. It's a bringing together of all of these things that I guess we can only really do at a local level, at a county level, to understand those different pressures that there is on land, whether it's energy or farming or nature. Juliet and team have been working their socks off to get a really good sense of actually what are the nature opportunities throughout Gloucestershire. And I guess one of the things that we need to do is work with local government to understand those different layers, so we have that land use framework in mind, so that we take some of the sweat out of the system, because absolutely right, it just slows everything down and creates conflict where there may not need to be. So I think there's something absolutely in that message for us all to work together locally.
Thank you. Before we take another member question, I just want to check if there are any questions in the room, if anyone's got anything they'd like to ask.
You've stunned them into silence.
Yeah. Okay, well, fab. We'll take another member question in that case. We've had a few questions come in about what plans there are or how we could do more to address flooding, and very topical for us here in Gloucestershire at the moment, and nationally, obviously, and how we can do more to embed nature and wildlife into the way that we deal with flooding.
Yeah. Well, I've served in many departments. DEFRA is not one of those, so I don't claim to be an expert on this. But there is obviously a lot of money being put in over a number of years. I mean, billions actually going into flood alleviation across the country. And I'm afraid this is, one of the challenges of a changing climate and rising water levels, is that this is something that increasingly we're going to face. And again, I sort of go back to my constituency where there was one particular area very close to the Thames where there was sort of constant flooding. We managed to get funding from central government, the Environment Agency, to sort of put up a bund to stop water sort of coming over. It sort of seems to be working, but as sea levels continue to rise, that is going to become more and more challenging. And there is a sort of a bigger issue here as well, in terms of ensuring homes and businesses. So I just take this to the international level, because I think that's as relevant wherever you are in the world. So in Australia, for instance, I've been out a sort of couple of times as part of the COP work that we've done, and I met first responders, those dealing with the wildfires and the flooding. And what they say is that what used to be 1 in 100-year events are now effectively becoming 1 in 5-year events. And there are homes and businesses that cannot get insurance. And by the way, that's not just in Australia. That's in California, that's around the world, in this country as well. So this is a really serious issue. Rising water levels are going to cause significant problems. There is a lot of money sort of that is being deployed by government. But again, we have to think about where are you building homes? I mean, we're going back to this issue of where are you building homes, and what will be the topography here in 10, 15 years if you build a home now? That's the sort of long-term thinking that we need to be doing actually really very quickly. Richard.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think those are really good points. And I think actually you were working with Oliver Letwin at the time when we created Flood Re, which is this reinsurance entity that means that people who couldn't otherwise get insurance for their homes because they live in heavy flood risk areas now can do. So it was an interesting change. I was actually trying to get something similar through the National Security Strategy Joint Committee to deal with cyber attacks, a sort of cyber re. Because we know from Gloucester City Council when it was attacked, how expensive that can be. So that's something that government is looking at. Look, the only other thing I thought would be useful to mention on flooding is that some years ago, a bundle of us created a sort of group of people called the Severn Partnership. And that's all the local government, members of parliament and so on, along the journey of the River Severn. And the reason that I wanted to help set this up was that ultimately what we have a problem with in this country is not so much water as water distribution. Because pretty well every summer, Thames Water, which is not far from Alok's constituency, they tend to run short of water. Whereas for about half of the year, we have too much in the River Severn. So it's about how do we get the water from the River Severn effectively stored and then shifted over to Thames Water to mean that they've got enough water for people living in London and so on. And there is a potential solution to this, which is basically to store more water in the Welsh Hills before it comes down the River Severn. That would prevent flooding in Gloucestershire much more effectively, really, than putting barriers up along the journey of the Severn, which just passes the buck on down the line. And then we could pipe it through the Severn and partly through these canals, which are connecting up, all the way down to Thames Water. And that could be a commercial exercise for Severn Trent. But there are two things that make it difficult. One is the upfront costs are enormous for creating new reservoirs, and you won't necessarily get everybody in Wales agreeing on where they should be. And then the second one is, again, the transportation costs of putting in the pipes to take them down there. But I think at some point that is the real solution to how we deal with water, is to work out where you've got too much, where you've got too little, and then try and find a means of distributing it more evenly. That would then make life a bit easier each winter in Gloucestershire. On that sad note of flooding, I have a feeling that our timing is a bit flooded out as well.
Very good.
So, Andrew, I was going to ask if whether you wanted to bring this gently to an end with a sort of a last few words before we steal Alok from the Wildlife Trust. Thank you.
Although I can sense Anna twitching to talk about flooding. Can you?
Well, it's more about the Severn to Thames transfer of which you refer. I mean, I think for us, we've got really grave concerns about that, and the fact that it's not a resilient option. It doesn't deal with any of the issues of underlying water insecurity, which is that we're not storing enough, we're using too much, and we're abstracting too much. So it seems like a really easy solution to move water from one side to the country to the other, although looking at how much water gets leaked, I think Thames water leaks more than they would actually move across the Thames transfer in its entirety in a day, so that needs dealing with. So to me, it's very much sticking a Band-Aid on an arterial bleed, and it needs a real lot of consideration to make that work from an environmental perspective. So that's just thought I'd give our perspective on that.
An ongoing topic for conversation.
The EEA, by the way, love it.
Not the EA members I've spoken to. So.
We'll
Yeah.
continue that conversation, but just wanted to say several thank you. So thank you very much for those of you joining us online. Thank you very much for those present in the room today. Thank you for the team who pulled all this together and lighting, and which is very warm today, and cameras as well. Thank you to panel members and for Richard for contributions today, but most of all, massive thank you to you, Alok, for coming to talk to us today. Some really powerful insights there from your work and thoughts of the future. So thank you very much for that. So just a small round of applause. Thank you very much for Alok. And I think we're good to draw to a conclusion. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.